The morning mist hung thick over the Ardennes forest on December 15th, 1944, as Private Tommy Henderson pulled his wool coat tighter against the bitter cold. He had no way of knowing that within hours, the relative quiet of this ghost front would explode into one of the most ferocious battles in Western European history. The young soldier from Ohio squinted through the fog, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, unaware that across the misty valleys, 250,000 German troops were making final preparations for Adolf Hitler's most desperate gamble for weeks. The Allied forces had grown comfortable in their positions along the 8I 5-mile stretch of the Ardennes. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group had thinned their lines here, considering this heavily forested region too difficult for any major German offensive. Was a calculated risk that would soon prove nearly catastrophic. The American 1st Army's 8th Corps, under Major General Troy Middleton, held this quiet sector with just 4 divisions, spread impossibly thin. They called it the Ghost Front because so little happened here, a name that would soon ring with bitter irony across the German lines. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and General Hasso von Manteuffel were orchestrating Operation Watch On, the Rhine later renamed Autumn Mist by Hitler himself. The Führer had conceived this audacious plan as Germany's last chance to split the Western Allies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force them into a separate peace that might allow Germany to concentrate all its remaining strength against the advancing Soviet armies in the east. 3 entire German armies, the 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army under Manteuffel, and the 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger, had been secretly assembled in the forests opposite the unsuspecting Americans. The German High Command had learned harsh lessons from their earlier offensives. They understood that success depended on speed, surprise, and the capture of vital fuel supplies, as their own reserves were critically low. Hitler had scraped together his last strategic reserves, including units pulled from the Eastern Front, despite the growing Soviet threat. Tank crews barely out of training school were mixed with grizzled veterans of the Russian steppes. The plan was audacious in its scope: punch through the American lines, race across the Meuse River, and reach Antwerp within a week. As Henderson and his fellow soldiers settled into their evening routines, German assault troops were already moving into position less than a mile away. The attackers had been ordered to maintain absolute radio silence, moving only at night and camouflaging their massive buildup during the day. Allied aerial reconnaissance, hampered by weeks of poor weather, had failed to detect the unprecedented concentration of German armor and artillery, hidden in the dense forests. The irony was palpable, while American soldiers wrote letters home about the quiet sector and their hopes for Christmas leave. German commanders synchronized their watches for the greatest surprise attack on Western Allied forces since D-Day. The stage was set for a battle that would test American resolve like no engagement since the dark days following Pearl Harbor. A confrontation that would ultimately demonstrate both the fragility and the resilience of democratic armies fighting for their survival against totalitarian desperation. At precisely 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, 1944, the winter darkness of the Ardennes forest was shattered by the flash and thunder of 1,600 German artillery pieces opening fire simultaneously along the entire front. Private Henderson was jolted awake in his foxhole as shells began screaming overhead, their deafening explosions sending fountains of dirt, snow, and shrapnel cascading down around him. The Ghost Front had suddenly become a living hell. The German barrage, while impressive in its scope, lasted only 90 minutes, a reflection of Germany's critical ammunition shortage. But it achieved its primary objective: stunning the American defenders and cutting vital communication lines just as 3 waves of German infantry emerged from the fog-shrouded forests like phantoms. Searchlights mounted on German tanks created an eerie, artificial moonlight, bouncing off the low-hanging clouds to illuminate the battlefield in ghostly silver. This innovative tactic, called artificial moonlight, allowed German forces to attack in darkness while maintaining visibility, a technique that caught American defenders completely off guard. Along the northern sector, Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army struck the positions held by the 99th Infantry Division, many of whose soldiers were experiencing combat for the first time. The Green troops, despite their inexperience, fought with desperate courage as Waffen-S units advanced. Through the snow-covered hills, at a small crossroads village called Krinkel-Troscherath, American tank destroyers and Sherman tanks engaged in fierce close-quarters combat with German Panzer IV and Tiger tanks, the narrow forest roads echoing with the metallic clash of armor. Warfare further south. General Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army achieved more dramatic initial success against the scattered positions of the 28th Infantry Division, the Bloody Bucket Division, as they were known from their keystone. Shoulder Patch found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the German assault. Entire companies were surrounded and cut off as German armor poured through gaps in the American lines, like water through a mirror. Broken Dam. According to historical accounts from the National World War II Museum, the German breakthrough achieved tactical surprise on a scale not seen since the early days of the war. Major General Norman Coda, commanding the 28th Infantry Division, found his headquarters under direct attack by German tanks before noon on the first day. Radio communications had been severed, supply lines cut, and his scattered battalions were fighting isolated actions against overwhelming odds. The most critical German objective was the capture of road junctions and bridges before American engineers could destroy them. German paratroopers, dropped behind American lines during the night, attempted to seize key crossroads, while fast-moving panzer columns raced toward the town of St. Vith and the vital road hub at Bastogne. These towns controlled the limited road network through the Ardennes. Their capture would determine whether the German offensive could maintain momentum toward the Meuse River by nightfall of December 16th. German spearheads had penetrated up to 6 miles into American positions. Refugees began streaming westward. American support troops, Belgian civilians, and scattered groups of combat soldiers who had lost contact with their units. The roads filled with a confused mixture of retreating vehicles and advancing German armor, creating a chaotic situation where friend and enemy often found themselves sharing the same muddy forest tracks in the darkness. As the first day of battle ended, the magnitude of the German offensive began to dawn on Allied commanders. This was not a local spoiling attack or a limited offensive. This was Germany's last great gamble in the West. December 17th dawned gray and cold. Low clouds that grounded Allied aircraft and gave German forces continued freedom of movement. However, the second day of the offensive revealed the first cracks in Hitler's grand design. While German units had achieved impressive initial penetrations, they were already falling behind the ambitious timetable that called for crossing the Meuse River by December 19th. At the small town of St. Vith, Brigadier General Bruce Clark's Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division had arrived just in time to establish a defensive perimeter. Clark, a West Point graduate known for his tactical brilliance, quickly realized that holding St. Vith was crucial to disrupting German supply lines. The town sat at the convergence of several key roads, and its capture would allow German armor to fan out toward multiple objectives. Clark's tankers, supported by remnants of the shattered 106th Infantry Division, began preparing hasty defenses among the medieval buildings and narrow streets. The German 5th Panzer Army, led by the experienced General Manteufel, pressed their attack with increasing desperation. Manteufel understood that each hour of delay allowed more American reinforcements to reach the battlefield. His panzer divisions, already low on fuel, could not afford to waste time reducing every pocket of resistance. Yet the stubborn American defense at St. Vith was forcing him to commit precious reserves that should have been racing toward Antwerp. Meanwhile, 20 miles to the south, General George Patton received urgent orders from Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower to halt his Third Army's advance toward the Saar and pivot north to strike the German flank. Patton, known for his aggressive tactics and colorful language, had been anticipating such an order. In one of the most impressive displays of military logistics in World War II, Patton's staff began the complex process of turning 3 entire divisions 90 degrees and moving them over icy roads toward the battle zone. The fog of war created confusion on both sides. German infiltration teams, some dressed in American uniforms and speaking English, had been inserted behind Allied lines as part of Operation Grief. These commandos, led by the famous Otto Skorzeny, succeeded in spreading panic far out of proportion. To their actual numbers, American military police began stopping vehicles at checkpoints, asking questions about American baseball and movie stars to identify German infiltrators. The paranoia reached such heights that General Bradley himself was temporarily detained when he incorrectly answered a question about the capital of Illinois, as referenced in Stephen Mabros's comprehensive study, Citizen Soldiers. The psychological impact of these infiltration tactics was enormous, but they also revealed German desperation rather than strength. By December 18th, American commanders began recognizing that the German offensive, while dangerous, was not the coordinated steamroller it had initially appeared to be. Intelligence reports indicated that German units were already experiencing fuel shortages, and captured prisoners revealed low morale among many. Wehrmacht formations hastily thrown into the attack. The weather remained Germany's greatest ally. Allied air power, which had dominated European skies since DA, remained grounded by the persistent overcast and fog. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs sat idle on airfields across France and Belgium, while German columns moved. With relative impunity during daylight hours, Luftwaffe fighters, preserved for this offensive, made their first significant appearances in months. Though their numbers remained pitifully small compared to Allied air strength by the third day, the battle's character was beginning to shift from a German offensive to a deadly game of maneuver and countermaneuver. With both sides racing to concentrate forces at critical points, December 19th brought the German offensive to its most critical juncture. The weather remained overcast and bitterly cold, with snow beginning to fall more heavily across the Ardennes battlefield. German advance units of the 2nd Panzer Division were now within sight of the Meuse River, closer to their ultimate objective than they would ever get again. Yet behind them, the American defense was beginning to coalesce around key strongpoints. And nowhere was this more evident than at the small Belgian town of Bastogne. Bastogne was not particularly impressive, a modest market town of 4,000 inhabitants surrounded by gently rolling farmland, but its strategic importance was enormous. 7 major roads converged on the town like spokes of a wheel, making it the key to rapid movement through the southern Ardennes. Whichever side controlled Bastogne would control the tempo of the battle in this crucial sector. Acting Divisional Commander Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division had arrived in Bastogne on December 19th with his paratroopers, still recovering from their grueling 62-day campaign in Holland during Operation Market Garden. The Screaming Eagles were supposed to be resting and refitting near Reims, but Eisenhower had committed his only strategic reserves to contain the German breakthrough. McAuliffe, a West Pointer known for his unflappable demeanor and dry wit, quickly assessed the situation and began preparing his paratroopers for a siege. The German forces converging on Bastogne represented some of Hitler's finest remaining units. The 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division were all veteran formations with experienced commanders. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, was confident that his combined arms force could overwhelm the lightly equipped American paratroopers. His tanks outnumbered McAuliffe's forces, and he possessed substantial artillery support. However, Luttwitz made a critical error in his approach to Bastogne. Rather than immediately launching a coordinated assault while the American defenses were still forming, he chose to surround the town and demand its surrender. This decision gave McAuliffe precious time to organize his perimeter defense and position his limited anti-tank guns at key approaches. The paratroopers, trained to operate behind enemy lines with minimal support, adapted quickly to their defensive role. The siege of Bastogne became a microcosm of the entire Battle of the Bulge, American tenacity against German desperation. Inadequate equipment against superior numbers, and individual courage against military doctrine. McAuliffe's men established strong points in the surrounding villages of Longvilly, Magoret, and Neff, creating an all-around defense that could, withstand attack from any direction. They were critically short of ammunition, medical supplies, and winter clothing. But their morale remained surprisingly high. On December 22nd, German commanders delivered an ultimatum to the American defenders, demanding immediate surrender. To avoid total annihilation, the Caliph's legendary response, "Nuts," came one of the most famous replies in military history. The message, when translated for the puzzled German negotiators, perfectly captured the defiant spirit that would ultimately doom Hitler's offensive, as documented by war correspondent Walter Cronkite, who later reported from the Bastogne perimeter. The psychological impact of the American refusal to surrender resonated far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Word of the paratroopers' defiance spread rapidly through Allied units across the Western Front, stiffening resistance everywhere and demonstrating that German forces were not invincible despite their initial successes. The battle for Bastogne was now set to become the decisive confrontation that would determine whether Germany's final gamble in the West would succeed or fail catastrophically. December 23rd, 1944, marked the pivotal moment when weather became the Battle of the Bulge's decisive factor. After a week of fog, overcast skies, and snow that had grounded Allied aviation, a massive high-pressure system moved across Western Europe, bringing crystalline blue skies and bitter cold.
Ow.
For the first time since the offensive began, American and British pilots could see their targets clearly, and the awesome power of Allied air superiority was about to be unleashed upon the exposed German columns. The transformation was immediate and devastating. Within hours of sunrise, over 2,000 Allied aircraft were airborne across the battle zone. P-47 Thunderbolts armed with rockets and 500-pound bombs dove upon German tank columns that had been moving freely for a week. PFD-1 Mustangs strafed supply convoys, while British Typhoons struck at German artillery positions with their deadly rockets. The Luftwaffe, despite having conserved aircraft for this offensive, could muster fewer than 200 fighters, a hopeless disadvantage that sealed Germany's fate. At Bastogne, the clear weather allowed for the first aerial resupply mission. To reach McAuliffe's surrounded paratroopers, C-47 transport aircraft, escorted by swarms of fighters, began dropping desperately needed ammunition, medical supplies, and winter clothing into the encircled perimeter. The sight of American parachutes blossoming over Bastogne provided an enormous morale boost to the defenders, who had been fighting on reduced rations and critically low ammunition for days. Colonel Creighton Abrams, leading the spearhead of Patton's 3rd Army Relief Force, was pushing his tanks northward through the snow-covered hills south of Bastogne. Abrams, whose aggressive leadership style perfectly complemented Patton's philosophy, drove his men relentlessly despite German resistance and treacherous road conditions. His Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division was racing against time, knowing that each hour of delay might mean the difference between relieving Bastogne or finding only ruins. The German situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Fuel shortages, which had been a concern from the offensive's beginning, now reached critical levels. Many panzer units were immobilized not by American resistance but by empty fuel tanks. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had advanced furthest toward the Meuse River, found itself stranded near Celles, Belgium. Surrounded by British forces and unable to retreat due to lack of fuel, General Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, recognized that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing. His most experienced division commanders were reporting that their units were combat ineffective due to casualties and mechanical breakdowns. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division had lost over 60% of its strength in futile attacks against the Bastogne perimeter, while the Panzerlehr Division was scattered across 20 miles of forest roads, harassed constantly by Allied fighter-bombers. According to military historian Hugh Cole's official U.S. Army history of the Ardennes campaign, December 23rd represented the moment when German operational flexibility collapsed entirely. Units that had moved with confidence under cover of weather were now trapped in exposed positions, unable to advance or retreat effectively. The initiative, so briefly in German hands, had passed irrevocably to the Allies. Heinrich Himmler, visiting the front as Hitler's representative, reported back to Berlin that the offensive had failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The port of Antwerp remained firmly in Allied hands. The Anglo-American alliance showed no signs of fracturing. German casualties were mounting at an unsustainable rate. Yet Hitler, isolated in his East Prussian headquarters and increasingly detached from reality, refused to authorize a withdrawal that might have saved many of his remaining reserves for the defense of Germany itself. The stage was now set for the final acts of Germany's last great offensive in the West. December 26th. 1944 became the day that marked the beginning of the end for Operation Autumn Mist. The morning dawned cold and clear, with visibility extending for miles across the snow-covered Ardennes landscape. Inside the besieged perimeter of Bastogne, Anthony McAuliffe's paratroopers prepared for what they assumed would be another day of desperate defensive fighting, unaware that relief was racing toward them through the Belgian countryside. At 4:45 in the afternoon, the distinctive roar of Sherman tank engines echoed through the southern outskirts of Bastogne. Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding the lead tank of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, rolled through the American lines and made contact with the 101st Airborne's forward positions. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The psychological impact of this moment resonated far beyond the immediate tactical situation. It demonstrated conclusively that German forces could be stopped, surrounded, and defeated, even when they achieved initial surprise. Colonel Crichton Abrams, whose relentless drive had brought the relief force through 60 miles of enemy territory in just 3 days, immediately began coordinating with McAuliffe to expand the corridor into Bastogne and evacuate the most seriously wounded. Paratroopers. The narrow supply route, quickly dubbed the Alley by American soldiers, remained under constant German artillery fire. But it provided a crucial lifeline that allowed the defenders to transition from survival mode to active operations. The success at Bastogne came at a critical moment for Allied morale. Initial reports of the German breakthrough had created genuine concern in Washington and London about the stability of the Western Front. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had privately expressed worry that Germany might achieve a negotiated settlement. That would leave Hitler in power, while American newspapers carried alarming headlines about German panzers racing toward the English Channel once again. George Patton, never modest about his achievements, declared the relief of Bastogne to be the most brilliant operation we have thus far performed. More importantly, he immediately began planning a broader counteroffensive to eliminate the German salient entirely. Patton understood that the extended German positions created an opportunity to encircle and destroy significant enemy forces if Allied units could coordinate attacks from multiple directions. Meanwhile, German commanders were finally receiving permission to withdraw their most exposed units. Field Marshal Model, commanding Army Group B, had argued for days that the offensive had failed and that remaining forces should be pulled back to defensible positions. Hitler's reluctant authorization came too late for many German units, particularly the 2nd Panzer Division, which was being systematically destroyed by British forces near the Meuse River. The Luftwaffe made its final major effort on January 1st, 1945, launching Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise attack on Allied airfields designed to regain air superiority. German pilots, many flying their first combat missions, attacked 17 Allied airfields simultaneously, destroying or damaging over 400 Allied aircraft on the ground. However, this tactical success came at a strategic cost that Germany could not afford. The Luftwaffe lost over 230 aircraft, and more critically, experienced pilots who could never be replaced. As documented in Charles MacDonald's definitive account, A Time for Trumpets, the period between December 26th and January 3rd marked the transition from German offensive to Allied counteroffensive throughout the Ardennes sector. American and British units, now reinforced and resupplied, began systematic attacks designed to eliminate the German salient and restore the pre-December 16th front lines. The Battle of the Bulge was entering its final phase. But the most costly fighting still lay ahead, as German forces attempted to conduct a fighting withdrawal through the same difficult terrain they had traversed during their initial advance. By January 3, 1945, the German position and the Ardennes had become untenable. What Hitler had envisioned as Germany's great counteroffensive had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival. Against overwhelming Allied forces attacking from three directions, the Bulge and Allied lines that had given the battle. Its popular name was rapidly contracting under pressure from Patton's Third Army advancing from the south, Montgomery's 21st Army Group pressing from the north, and the reformed 1st Army attacking from the west. The German withdrawal through the frozen Ardennes forests became a nightmare of tactical complexity. Units that had advanced along narrow forest roads now found themselves trapped in the same confined terrain, unable to deploy effectively against Allied attacks while struggling to maintain any semblance of military organization. The roads that had channeled German armor toward their objectives now became killing zones where Allied fighter bombers could attack virtually unopposed. General Manteuffel, whose 5th Panzer Army had achieved the deepest penetration toward the Meuse River, conducted a masterful fighting withdrawal that preserved much of his remaining force. His tactical skill stood in sharp contrast to the strategic blundering that had initiated the offensive. Manteuffel understood that Germany could no longer afford to trade space for time. Every tank, every experienced soldier, and every gallon of fuel would be desperately needed for the defense of the Rhine River, and ultimately, Germany itself. The human cost of Hitler's final gamble was becoming apparent as Allied forces advanced through the abandoned German positions. American casualties exceeded 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 missing or captured. Losses that rivaled those suffered during the Normandy invasion 6 months earlier. German casualties were even more severe, with conservative estimates placing their losses at over 100,000 men, including many irreplaceable veterans and tank crews. More significantly, the Battle of the Bulge had consumed Germany's last strategic reserves in the west. Tank divisions that might have delayed the Allied advance to the Rhine were destroyed or so badly damaged that they ceased to exist as effective fighting units. The 6th Panzer Army, elite formations that had been withdrawn from the Eastern Front specifically for this offensive, lost over 60% of their armor and experienced personnel who could never be replaced. Given Germany's desperate manpower situation, Adolf Hitler's reaction to the failure demonstrated his complete disconnection from military reality. Rather than acknowledging that Operation Autumn Mist had weakened Germany's position catastrophically, he blamed the defeat on subordinate commanders' lack of determination and began planning additional offensives with non-existent resources. This delusional thinking would characterize German strategy during the final months of the war. According to military historian Russell Weigley's analysis in Eisenhower's Lieutenants, the Battle of the Bulge marked the moment when German military resistance in Western Europe transitioned from organized defense to desperate delaying actions. The Wehrmacht's ability to conduct coordinated operations above division level had been broken, leaving individual units to fight isolated holding actions while Allied forces advanced toward Germany's industrial heartland. By January 28, 1945, American forces had restored the original front lines that existed before December 16. The Battle of the Bulge was officially over, though its consequences would shape the remaining months of the European war. The German army in the West had been fatally weakened, shortening the war and saving countless lives on both sides. Young soldiers like Private Tommy Henderson, who had survived the initial German onslaught in their foxholes along the Ghost Front, emerged from the Ardennes forests as hardened veterans. They had proven that democratic armies, despite their apparent softness and individualistic culture, possessed a resilience and determination that totalitarian forces could not match. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated that Germany's military machine, for all its tactical excellence and technological innovation, could not overcome the fundamental strategic weaknesses that doomed the Third Reich from the beginning. The Allies had survived Hitler's last great gamble and were now positioned to carry the war into Germany itself, where the final chapter of the European conflict would be written among the ruins of the Thousand-Year Reich.